Welcome to this edition of the Capital Brief. I'm Seth Berenzweig from Berenzweig Leonard here in our beautiful BL Media Studios in downtown Tysons, Virginia, here with our colleague and friend John Tamny from RealClearMarkets. Hey, John, how you doing?
Great. Good to be here.
Good. So we're here today to talk about an interesting topic, and it is kind of based upon some kind of a statement or assertion that is so frequently made, but so rarely discussed or questioned. And it also covers a very interesting article that you wrote recently in RealClearMarkets entitled, "President Biden is the latest to promote the fib that corporations pay no taxes." Of course, I read this with interest because I read everything that you write with interest. But can you tell us what this potential fib is, and let's kind of jump into the how and the why of this, because if I've heard it once, I've heard it a million times. Many corporations in America, they pay absolutely no taxes. Tell us about it.
Well, that's what Biden's working with. There's a list produced by a think tank somewhere in the area saying there are 55 fairly major corporations that didn't in fact pay taxes, and they love to bring up that some of these years Amazon's been one of those corporations that didn't. That is a falsehood. It cannot be stressed enough that it's a falsehood because corporations as tax-paying entities are a fiction. Corporations are owned by shareholders. Shareholders pay the taxes. And so to pretend that shareholders don't pay taxes beggars belief. In fact, these are the biggest handers over of wealth annually to the U.S. Treasury. And so it's an insult to presume what politicians on both sides assume.
So I think there'll be a lot of areas of intersection in which you and I are going to have similar thoughts here. But let's set the table a little bit about this statement, because I think it would be impossible to overstate how frequently this assertion is made in this town here in Washington, D.C. and across the country. The notion and the assertion that lots of corporations pay absolutely no taxes is something that is regularly browbeated and discussed. As you've correctly said, the president has said it. He said it at a recent economic policy forum about the so-called list of 55. He's talked about it. A lot of the other politicians have talked about it. It becomes part of the political warfare and part of the economic warfare. And a lot of economic warfare has become culturally embedded into the daily narrative discourse. I mean, I think it's indirectly relevant. I remember one day after work, I went on my Twitter feed and I saw AOC at a lavish Met Gala, and she had on her infamous Tax the Rich dress. And the thing that I found so interesting about it is that I don't think that any of us, certainly myself, I couldn't even barely afford half the price of the ticket to even go into that. So we had a bunch of rich people walking around laughing about taxing the rich, what seemed a little ironic to me. But this is something that is really pressed out there, and to talk about the serious consequences of it, just to continue on a point about AOC. This was a claim that she asserted not long ago in fighting against Amazon, so-called Amazon HQ2, the additional Amazon headquarters, when it was looking for a home, and we're happy that it ended up generally in this area, here in the Northern Virginia area. They were looking at New York, specifically in the Brooklyn area. And she said, no corporate welfare, darn it. We're not going to let Amazon here. And in so doing, she shoved them away and kept lots of people from being able to get more income, better tax base, increased real estate values. It was just an absolutely unbelievable move on her part, even though she heralded herself as a hero. So before we go into the analysis, which I think you've really hit into a big nerve on that, I just wanted to take a step back and say I think that this is something that not only is said a lot, but contributes to a lot of the economic, cultural pollution of what's going on in economic discourse today. But let's now turn back to the conversation on, obviously, as to whether or not it's truth or a lie. Help explain a bit more as to why you believe that this is something that, as you say in your article, is a fib.
Well, I think it's worthwhile to touch on the Amazon scenario because it's an important one in talking about this more broadly. There is a myth that's promoted just as much by the right as the left, and maybe more by the right, that small businesses are the backbone of the American economy. Nothing could be more absurd. And how you know that is just we're near the Tyson's Corner Mall right here.
Yep.
What you always see with shopping malls is there are very large, frequently internationally known anchor tenants that are most prominent when you arrive, and then smaller names cluster around them.
Right.
That's true of any shopping area, realistically anywhere in the world. The big are the instigator of the arrivals and the formation of the small. And so when AOC made her statement against Amazon, crony capitalism and all this, what she was saying, she was driving away the very kind of business that was going to author the arrival of all sorts of others to the Brooklyn, Queens area.
Incredible.
And so it's important to consider this through the prism. Well, why does Amazon exist? It exists because of taxpayers, people who paid the most in taxes. The New York Times routinely points out in pejorative fashion that the top 15% of taxpayers own, or no, 10% of taxpayers own 85% of public shares. And they say that negatively, but it's just a reminder that the rich, precisely because they're rich, have wealth left over after they've paid taxes to invest. Without the rich, there'd be very little economic progress. There would not be Amazon. Most technology startups fail. It takes a lot of unspent wealth, risk-focused wealth, to get Amazons, because there were lots that tried to be Amazon and didn't do it. And so you look at this. These corporations don't pay taxes. No, they are owned by the biggest shareholders in the world, individuals who pay enormous amounts in taxes. To focus on the corporate tax
And risk. They're investors.
Of course, the biggest risk.
Yeah.
And to focus on the corporate tax is to miss that there are no corporations without people committing capital to new ideas after they've paid taxes on their income.
Right. You know, politically, I'm very much straight down the middle of the road, but it really strikes me sometimes to see some of the Democrats in Congress talking about taxes as if they are a surcharge on buckets of gold coins. It's just not sitting in the corner of the room. You're putting risk capital on the table, and you can lose it all, or you can make, or you can have a gain from that. But as you say, risk capital is part of one of the main engines that helps drive the economy. I'd like to go back to something that you said a moment ago, which I think is also interesting, and I'd like to kind of flesh that out a little bit. You were saying a point that taxes are paid in corporate America because a lot of those taxes are drafted through to the shareholders, and then the shareholders, of course, pay their taxes. And I'd just like to add some color to that. There are different kinds of business entities today, and there are corporations and there are companies, limited liability companies. For corporations, the two main kinds of corporations are S corps and C corps. I'm not trying to be academic. What I'm saying is that S corps have what's called pass-through taxation. The corporations that are S corps, by definition, thanks to an act of Congress, they're not going to pay federal income taxes because it is a pass-through entity. And to your point, exactly, it is paid by the shareholders. Approximately what percentage of corporations in America today are registered as S corps versus C? Roughly 2/3. So that means that nearly 2/3 of corporations, by design, in full compliance with congressional mandate, have pass-through taxes, which means that the corporations themselves are not going to pay taxes because legally they're not supposed to pay them. That's a fact that supports your point, but is an element that the president and some others in Congress don't point to. Also, there are a lot of businesses that are LLCs, limited liability companies. They're also pass-through entities. When you add up the S corps and the limited liability companies in America, they're well over 2/3 of the business entities. So the reason that I'm saying this is because the basic structure of how federal taxes operate as a flow-through isn't because Jeff Bezos or other people are just kind of, in back dark alley rooms trying to figure out evil ways to not follow the rules of taxation. They're following the rules. So to your point, the reason why it flows through is because it's exactly what it's supposed to do. That's how these businesses were formed. That's how the tax code was created. It was created by Congress. We're talking about people that follow the rules, not people that try to bend the rules.
Yeah, you're so right, and it's so important to expand on that. Why is the tax code complicated in this way, or why? It fascinated me. It didn't fascinate me because this is what politicians do, that Joe Biden was complaining about a tax code that, as someone who served in the Senate since the early 1970s,
Right.
has clearly had a major role in creating, in
Right.
bemoaning the scenarios that lead to corporations, quote, not paying taxes. It was as though he was hitting himself.
Yeah.
And we know why he was hitting himself. When you are in politics, wealth finds you. It doesn't mean that it directly gets to you, but it's no coincidence that all of the Biden family members are kind of well-to-do today.
Right.
It's no coincidence that if you went through his past chiefs of staff, I'm sure you could find some pretty high incomes in Washington, D.C.
Right.
We have a complicated tax code precisely because politicians love wealth in much the same way that Jeff Bezos may love wealth, only they want to get it differently. The tax code, an unwieldy, uncomplicated tax code, is their friend. Joe Biden, you are the enemy in this.
Right.
In what you're bemoaning right now.
Well, and ironically, these companies probably pay a small fortune to certified public accounting firms to try to figure out how to apply all of this. Because if it was simplified, then there wouldn't be such a torturous task to be able to go through and follow the tax code. When you talk about tax compliance, when you talk about Sarbanes-Oxley, when you talk about all those elements of federal compliance, that's not light lifting. These are things that corporations have to follow, and when corporations don't follow them, then they can get anything from just a warning letter or a civil money penalty to a grand jury subpoena. So this is not light stuff. The other thing that I find really interesting about the politicians, our friends here on Capitol Hill in Washington, who try to bemoan issues of taxes in the corporate world, is that virtually none of them ever made payroll. Mm-hmm. What I mean by that, virtually none of them ever set up a business and actually had to go in and wonder, do I have enough money in my business's operating account to clear payroll today? Do I have enough business? Do I have enough money in my business's operating account as of December so that I'm not only going to be able to pay Christmas bonuses to retain employees, but do I have enough to pay my social taxes? This is another element of the tax conversation that's never discussed in terms of business because these people have never run a business. Mm-hmm. They've never run a business. We run a business here. We're a mid-sized business law firm. We pay social taxes. We pay FICA. We contribute to social taxes as well as other additional voluntary contributions to employees for additional employee retention, for other health-related group health plan benefits. So it's on that level alone completely false to say that corporations never pay taxes because they pay social taxes. They pay to Social Security. They pay FICA. They pay all these levels of social taxes, and that's never discussed. And the reason that people on Capitol Hill don't discuss it is that they've never run a payroll. What do they know about running a business other than going out to an exclusive gala wearing a jacket that says that they should go ahead and that they, through taxes, should punish people who are successful for setting up the businesses that are helping to support all these other fine workers?
Well, it's so important what you say. I love how you describe the year-end bonuses to retain employees.
Sure.
There's this myth that businesses go out of their way to stiff their employees. I've never met a well-run business that's done that. Every well-run business I've ever seen tries to preempt its employees asking for a raise by giving it because the cost of underpaying your employees is so great. Mm-hmm. But you describe very well, because you know it very well, the different ways that your business is paying taxes.
Right.
And that just leaves aside. So that's that. And then you factor in that every business does have owners and they are paying taxes. And so what is a corporate tax? It's merely a signal that Congress feels it didn't get enough of the owner's individual income.
Right.
So let's take another swipe. The corporate tax is a mere signal of double taxation of individual earnings. All companies are the remuneration of abstinence, as in people, rather than consuming with abandon, save the money that they have after they've paid taxes to invest in new ideas. Let's end this insulting notion that corporations don't pay taxes. No, people are corporations, and they most certainly do by virtue of owning them in the first place.
And not only do those people pay taxes, and I'm 100% spot on with you with that, but the corporations, even if they're not a subchapter C Corp, which, by the way, will then pay its own level of taxes, but even if it's purely a pass-through entity, if you're an LLC or an LLP, and if it's simply pass-through, you're still paying taxes. You're still paying a wide variety of social taxes. You're still responsible for that. And at the end of the year, when we run our final payroll, which is our largest payroll of the year, and I say this as a business owner and a managing partner of a firm, we always leave a large component of the outflow of cash to make sure that when we run those calculations with our bookkeeper and our tax advisor, that we leave extra layers for tax, because the more that you bonus your employees, the larger the tax burden that associates with that in terms of the social taxes that correlate with larger bonus checks. So every business in America pays taxes, but again, I'm not trying to pick on AOC because, I'm sure she has a good time at these balls, but honestly, with all due respect, she's never run a payroll, so she really wouldn't know that to begin with. So is this relevant to what's happening here in Washington today? There are a lot of conversations that are happening here about the infrastructure bill. And if anyone out there is going to tell me that they know exactly what's going on with the infrastructure bill, well, then you owe me a beer, because you're lying. Nobody knows what's going on. Nancy Pelosi doesn't know what's going on. Is this endemic of a bureaucracy in Washington that is really just looking for ways to continue to beef up a manner in which they can get more money in the trough to be able to pay for things and not really focus on the national debt ceiling? Where can you identify, and I'm not trying to make this a Socratic question, have you ever seen any indication of fiscal discipline on Capitol Hill as it relates to trying to decrease the necessity to have to pay from federal taxes?
Of course not. And it doesn't matter who's in power. Think back to Barack Obama when he got into office. He said, we're going to go line by line through the budget and cut out the fat. Well, of course that didn't happen.
Right.
It doesn't happen when Republicans are in office, when they're in control either. And
True.
we know why. They respond to incentives, A, and B, they want to retire in comfort just as much as anyone else does. It does a politician no favors to shrink government, because if you shrink what government is throwing out there every year, you shrink your retirement. Your wealth after politics, which pays in a relative sense not very well,
Right.
is made up for by the fact that family members are going to get jobs based on how you're allocating trillions of dollars, not to mention the kind of work you will do once you're retired or you are voted out of office. If you're voted out of office and the budget is $6 trillion, you have a lot more opportunities to make a lot of money than if the budget's $1 trillion. And so we can see why both sides, for a variety of reasons, in addition to trading votes, everyone's got some pet project they like, that the government continues to grow.
And to be fair, from a political standpoint, I think that lack of fiscal discipline is an issue that floats over both sides of the aisle. Just so that I don't sound like I'm on an AOC bashing spree today, I think that President Trump really paid more lip service than actual, hard focus on being fiscally responsible. The Republicans back in the day were a lot more about shrinking government and expanding the economy. And now we're hearing every day about what are we going to be doing and when are we going to be running up to the debt ceiling. The only conversation with respect to a debt ceiling in Washington is how quickly we can raise the debt ceiling. I've never heard anybody suggest that there be any kind of a committee or any kind of a meeting in Washington to sit down and talk about what we can do as a plan, as a projection into the future for reducing the debt ceiling. Because if we keep doing this and if we just keep borrowing against ourselves, then it's just going to be chaotic. So I think that there's enough blame to go across both sides of the aisle on that. So just kind of bringing this down into a conclusion, we're talking about things that are really directly connected to each other. We're talking about tax policy, and we're talking about how that's going to fit into the congressional plans and conversations in terms of a lot of major congressional initiatives related to infrastructure that can deal with roads, it can deal with chip shortages, whatever it is. How do you see this playing out over the next 30 days? Is there going to be fiscal discipline? Will the Joe Manchins of the world come in and have their day to be able to try to impose some kind of a reasonable fiscal middle ground or not? Where do you see this headed over the next 30 days?
Oh, it's, with Republicans, we always say, or at least I always say, why not ask for a massive tax cut knowing you're not going to get it? And yet they still always lead with, okay, well, we'll do the smaller one if you'll join us. Mm-hmm. Well, Joe Biden, let's give him credit. He's playing this absolutely right. Ask for something enormous that you know you're not going to get,
right,
and that Manchin's not going to give you, so that you can get a portion of what you wanted. And so the Democrats are going big. Why wouldn't you? That's rhetorically good for your base.
Yeah.
You've got to feed your flock, and so they're doing that.
Yeah.
And then Manchin will probably give them less. Divided Congress generally results in a smaller outcome than you'd expect. Mm-hmm. The debt ceiling in some shape or form obviously will be expanded. Republicans demagogue it when they're out of power. Democrats do it. You can find quotes about Barack Obama saying expanding the debt ceiling is just awful, but once he was in the White House, of course, he said it was essential. Both sides do this. We know all this.
Right.
We're wise to the game. These things will be taken care of. Thankfully, with divided government like this, I think the outcome is actually going to be better for the limited government crowd than it would be for those who want to expand it. Interesting.
I like your approach on thinking that maybe Biden's playing Manchin. I like that. And listen, he's not a dummy. He's been around the game and around the block. I predict that this is going to continue to become a hotter issue inside Congress because of the financial issues that are happening and surrounding outside of Congress. We have, at least to some degree, increasing inflation. We have, at least to some degree, some kind of debt contagion for some nations, and there's a genuine issue as it might relate to China and some things that are happening there that are showing some potential signs of economic instability. And we are still bumping up against a serious problem on the debt ceiling. So while Congress dithers, the temperature in the room continues to go up. So, John, again, thanks again for a great conversation, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.
Sounds good.